interactive workshop session that we are sharing today. I would like to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes with an overview of some key areas, and then give you some time in small groups to discuss some of the questions that I've covered, but also to consider two particular questions I'd like you to think about in your small groups. And then hopefully the timing will allow us to have a brief report back for about 5 minutes, and then maybe some closing wrap up. But I know we're on a tight schedule, so we'll just need to see how that goes. So let's start with an overview of topic, some content to get us thinking. We're all very aware that 2020 has been the year of coronavirus. It's been a year of disruption and chaos in some respects. It's been a year of change and adaptation in others. And it's been perhaps a year of opportunity and creativity. So if we thought a little bit more about disruption and chaos, we've had recurring periods of lockdown in many European countries, postponed family events, weddings, cancelled holidays, and cancelled examinations, of course, as well. In terms of change and adaptation, many of us have shifted to home working and homeschooling. Doctors' appointments have been online instead of face-to-face, and we've learned some new social habits, mask wearing and elbow bumps among them, and interacting in a digital, virtual environment. But it's also been a year of opportunity and creativity. So many people have stepped up to volunteer to help others. People have learned how to make bread and play a musical instrument and developed online family quizzes. And we've appreciated the natural world, and in the UK, especially the NHS. And in my local environment, the public artwork has been fantastic to see. And of course, that's the nature of being human, disruption and chaos, but perhaps with an element of change and adaptation that results from it, and also a level of imagination, opportunity, and creativity. And I suspect that the 2020s will be a decade of the same. But the question for us today is to consider, so what might this mean for some key areas of our work in language testing and assessment? Well, I'd like to highlight 3 particular areas of challenge for language testing and assessment in the 2020s. Now, these are not the only ones. These are the 3 that are perhaps a bit close to my heart and to the hearts of many of us. But they do link to larger fields which relate to sort of bigger umbrella topics. The first challenge or area that I would highlight is related to oral communication skills, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And we could locate that, if you like, within the bigger umbrella label of construct definition and operationalization. The second area of challenge I would highlight is the role and impact of technology. And perhaps this links closely in with test design, delivery, and processing. And there have been various presentations at this event focusing on those. And the third area that I would highlight is the area of assessment literacy, which, as many of you know, is again quite close to my heart. And this links to issues of stakeholder awareness and the language testing community's awareness of stakeholders as well. And communication with those constituencies, with our stakeholder constituencies. I think it's important to say that these areas of challenge are pre-existing areas in some respects, but they have been accelerated by the pandemic. So COVID-19 has proved to be both a cause of and a catalyst for focus and action during the 2020s. Let's look first at oral communication skills. I think there has been a growing and loud trend towards good oral communication skills, the importance of being able to communicate well using our oral communication skills. And clearly that's what we're seeking to do now, although we're all in different places around the world. So the importance of good oral communication skills will continue to be a dominant focus. And that will have impacts, and is already having impacts on approaches to oral assessment. And perhaps there are tests where oral skills have not been a dominant feature up to now, but I think in the future will be. I think beyond that, oral communication skills within specific domains is going to become increasingly important. We already know about that in certain professional employment contexts, among doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers in the aviation industry, among teachers in the teaching and learning community, and so on. But there are other areas as well. And a good example of this is I have another role in the police force locally as a chaplain, and have been discussing recently how armed response police officers use 4 oral communication skills steps before they reach that lethal force point. So that has an interesting impact on the training of police officers, good oral communication skills in their day-to-day work. And of course, there's the integration of oral communication skills with other modalities, with reading and speaking, and that has been a growing area and will continue. But the big shift, I think, in the 2020s is going to be the impact of digital and virtual interaction on communicative practices, and the way in which this sort of thing has changed radically our communication practices. So we now have, a situation where we need skills in navigating and interacting in the virtual space. We all have experience of this over the last few months, things we were not doing 18 months ago. Learning how to use mute, learning how to use video, using the chat and the raise the hand functions. The whole question of what the background is, whether that's a distracting background for the interaction. Barry O'Sullivan seemed to be trapped in space a lot of the time in some of the interactions I had with him because of his background. There's also the impact of body language, visual clues that we wouldn't normally have in the virtual space that we rely on in a face-to-face, and the impact on cognition, on cognitive load. There's some interesting research recently come out of Stanford University looking at, the impact of seeing yourself on video in virtual interaction, which you don't normally do in face-to-face interaction. How distracting is it? How much do you worry about how you look? And also the impact of intense visual gaze. It's draining, it's tiring, it's stressful. It can be anxiety creating. So the whole area of interactional and pragmatic competence is going to be one which we I think will need to look at very carefully. And it may be that actually we will need to start thinking about either expanding our current construct of interactional competence, or describing a new interactional competence construct based on how interaction happens in a virtual world. That's very interesting. I think the jury is out as to whether there's an overlapping construct here or whether there are 2 separate constructs that could be defined. And those will have implications for the way in which we do assessment. Interestingly, the companion volume to the CFR has highlighted the role and importance of mediation, and given it a discourse, a vocabulary that we can use to explore some of these. And I think this will be an interesting area for assessment, a challenging area. Do we assess mediation skills, or actually is mediation to be understood as an integrative, agentive, action-oriented phenomenon, as Brian North described yesterday? What will be the role of things like code switching, translanguaging, and so on in assessment? I think that as a result of all of this is going to be a greater demand for interdisciplinary research and collaboration, language assessment folk working more closely with computational linguists, with corpus linguists, with AI specialists, but also with constituencies in language education and in professional domains. And one of the things that I'll come back to is the importance of being able to talk to those who are outside our own community. And then, of course, there's the diversification in oral assessment approaches. And this takes us neatly on to my second area, the role and impact of technology. So here we have to think about the digital revolution in language testing and assessment that we're all a part of now. Remote proctoring is something that has already been accepted very widely. It's something that will need to be reviewed and critiqued and improved and understood better, I imagine. Task design and delivery issues are evident, particularly the scramble over the past year to online assessment for access to higher education and various other things. And here I think we can pick up on what Barry was saying earlier about the importance of context of use and test and fitness for purpose. Automated scoring approaches in both the assessment of writing and speaking are becoming increasingly part and parcel of our work. I'm especially interested in the extent to which interactional competence can be assessed by things like spoken dialogue systems. Again, I feel there's interesting work going on, but much more needs to be done to understand the interactional competence construct in a rich and deep sense, and then to determine whether, in fact, there are advantages to using automated scoring approaches. Multimodal digital literacy will undoubtedly become much more central than it has been to date. And this provides opportunities, I think, for new and exciting task design. Integrated teaching and learning and assessment will become increasingly important because of the affordances offered by technology, allowing perhaps a greater level of diagnostic assessment and personalized assessment or personalized assessment journeys. There are some issues, of course, with having a technology that allows us to access huge amounts of data. There are benefits to this. There are also points that we need to consider very carefully. There's just the practical reality of, having too much data, drowning in data because we can gather it. The key is going to be to identify which is the important, relevant data for our context and purpose. There are, of course, the limits and affordances of technology. I've already referred to the role of automated scoring, but I would love to engage with conversations that focus on, what do human raters do best and what do machine raters do best? So I think there's tremendous scope for work in those areas. And then, of course, there are implications for validation research and ethics, especially with issues to do with surveillance, with safeguarding, with privacy. And Luke Harding gave a great talk earlier to Teachers College Columbia in January, highlighting some of these important ethical issues that we will need to address and grapple with. I'd like to think that we're not talking about the sort of paradox of technology being the servant or the master, but rather the partner in assessment, just like any other stakeholder, perhaps. And then, of course, this takes us on very naturally to assessment literacy. Testing and assessment are undoubtedly a hot topic in media and public discourse, particularly in the UK, where school-based examinations could not take place in the usual way last summer and are in doubt this summer. And the public, policymakers, the media have all been very vocal in their feelings about testing and assessment. And there's been a wide-ranging discussion of issues to do with fairness and equity. I think we're going to need to work harder in our language testing and assessment community to address our communication shortfall with the wider public. And this is something Barry mentioned as well. The importance of score interpretation and use is going to be increasingly important, particularly in higher education contexts. And that takes us to, the evolving nature of language assessment literacy. Some of us are talking at the moment about, what assessment literacy actually is, what it should be, whether that's the best label for it, or whether it's actually about other things than literacy. And I think we need to work on our, let's call it our LAL theory, as well as our LAL practice. I think there will be a growing interest in and challenges around test comparability, and frameworks of reference will need to develop to help us understand and navigate those issues of test comparability as more and more tests come into the marketplace or into the everyday work that we're doing. And again, something that Luke highlighted was the question of ideologies in language assessment and their impact. Whose standards? This is something we've been talking about for a long time, and I've written about in various places, but the challenge continues to identify which are the appropriate standards for assessment. How do we define our construct in terms of, let's say, pronunciation norms, even I think increasingly things to do with spelling and grammatical norms, when the language that we see in social media, text messages, etc., is so flexible. I don't want to use the word incorrect. And then finally, something else that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the issue of the metaphors we test by. This is linked to the language that we use to talk about testing and assessment, both among ourselves and more widely with other stakeholder groups and in society more broadly. How can we develop a better language to use with people who are not in the same and don't have the same technical vocabulary? We've not been very good at that. We need to tell better stories. We need to tell them in a language that is more easily understood, that can be a communicative tool. And I think one of the things I'd like to see greater work done on in the next few years is a greater understanding of the representations of testing and assessment in the public domain, because by understanding how testing and assessment are viewed, including issues to do with fairness and equity and validity, these words that are bandied about by ourselves, then perhaps we will be able to better engage in conversation, meaningful conversation. So lots to think about there. And this is the point where you have some discussion time in small groups. I think I've probably taken a little bit longer than I should have done, but I hope that's given you some food for thought. And I think we probably do just about have time for 10 to 15 minutes of discussion. So here are the questions. 2 key questions for one or more of the areas of challenge. And then identify one insight or suggestion that you could come back with. And here are your questions. From your own, for your own particular context, what issues in any of these 3 areas do you think will pose the greatest challenge for you and your colleagues in the 2020s? Because we represent different contexts. And to be more positive, for any of these 3 areas, what excites you most about the opportunities that lie ahead for you and your colleagues in the 2020s? Okay, so I'm going to allow the groups to be formed now. I hope you will all be allocated to a group and you'll have some time to discuss in small groups.